All right, moving on to another structure, which is of the eye. Remember, we said in our previous video to say the blind spot is usually the exit point for the optic nerve, and light which falls on the blind spot or which is refracted on the blind spot cannot be detected, right? Now we move on to this structure, which is the optic nerve. So this optic nerve is simply a nerve having sensory neurons. And remember, we said that these sensory neurons, they detect impulses from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system, which is the brain, for interpretation. So this optic nerve is the one having sensory neurons that transmit nerve impulses from the retina to the visual center of the brain. So there is also the transmission of some electrical impulses that is being done in the eye, and the one that is responsible having those sensory neurons is the optic nerve. Let's move on to another structure of the eye, which is the vitreous humor. So this vitreous humor is simply a jelly-like fluid which keeps the eyeball in shape. All right. Apart from that, the vitreous humor also helps to refract light rays and supports the lens and keeps the retina in place at the rear of the eye. All this is being done by the vitreous humor. When we talk about um, keeping the eyeball in shape, refraction of light, supporting the lens, and keeping the retina in place, all this is done by the vitreous humor. Then we move on to the aqueous humor, which is simply a watery fluid which is supporting the cornea and keeps the eye in shape. The one that supports the cornea is the aqueous humor. Now let's look at some functions of the eye. So the eye is responsible to help us in the formation of images, number one. Number two, focusing and accommodation, right? When we talk about accommodation, I'm sure you've ever gone to a place and you say, I'm looking for accommodation. So there's also accommodation that happens in the eye. What happens when there is so much light? What happens when there is less light? How is the light diminished, or how is it reduced to the correct amount in order for you to see clearly? All that is accommodation of the eye. Then finally we move on to the pupil or the iris reflex. So this is also another function of the eye. There are times when if you are in a dark room and then you go to a bright room, you'd find to say the size of your pupil changes. Again, when you were outside where there was so much light and you enter inside a room, the pupil is going to also change. All that is happening in order to accommodate a certain amount of light to enable you to see, right? I'm sure when you were somewhere outside, you just noticed after moving from outside, you entered inside the room, you discover that you couldn't see something for quite a number of seconds. And after a while, now you could see clearly. So all that which is happening is accommodation, and it is also showing us a bit on this pupil and iris reflex. Then let's move on to the formation of images. So the part of the eye where images are formed is called the retina. So this is where images are formed. So the images that are formed have the following characteristics. Number one, they are invented, right? So images that are formed on the retina are always upside down. Apart from that, they are also diminished, which is smaller than the object, right? And then apart from that, another characteristic is that they are real and can be produced on screens, right? So we are being told here to say, though the images on the retina are invented, they are seen the right way up because the brain gives the correct interpretation of the images. Information about the image is carried from the retina to the brain by the optic nerve. Remember, we said the optic nerve has got some sensory neurons. Let's move on to focusing and accommodation of the eye. So when you talk about focusing, it is simply the formation of a clear image on the retina, right? Accommodation is simply the process by which the eye forms a focused image on the retina by adjusting the thickness and the length of the lens using suspensory ligaments and ciliary muscles in response to the distance of the object away from the eye. So when we talk about the adjusting, which is being done by simply allowing the thickness and the length of the lens, using suspensory ligament and ciliary muscles in response to the distance, all this is what we call accommodation, right? So accommodation has to occur in order for you to view objects that are near or that are far. So let's look at accommodation when the objects are near or quite close. So the rays from the objects are divergent, right? So to focus the images on the retina, the following events takes place. Number one, the ciliary muscles contract, the suspensory ligaments become slackened, the lens becomes short and thick, then the light rays are more refracted, thereby focusing the image on the retina. So this is what happens during accommodation of the eye. When the objects are nearby, number one, we say the ciliary muscles are going to contract, then the suspensory ligaments become slackened, the lens becomes short and thick, and then the light rays are more refracted. Now let's look at accommodation when objects are distant or far. Number one, the light rays from distant objects are more or less parallel to each other, and they do not require much refraction to be focused on the retina. So the following events are the ones that are going to happen. Remember, in this one we said much refraction is required. Well, for accommodation when the objects are far, there is not much refraction which is required. So here what happens is that the ciliary muscles are relaxing. In here the ciliary muscles were what? Contracting. Here the suspensory ligaments become taut, making the lens long and thick. All right, that is what happens to the lens. So here it is short and it is thick. Here we are saying it becomes long and thin. Then the light rays are less refracted, thereby focusing the image on the retina. Let's now move on to the pupil and iris reflex. So this is simply the adjustment of the diameter of the pupil by the saccular and the radial muscles of the iris. Remember we said this iris has got saccular and radial muscles. So this is for the response to change in light intensity. So when there's so much light, when you look at the sunlight directly, this pupil and iris reflex has to happen where the saccular and the radial muscles are involved. So let's talk about in bright light or high light intensity. So what happens? So excess light may damage the retina by bleaching it. So what happens? To prevent this, the following events are going to happen. Number one, the saccular muscles are going to contract while the radial muscles are going to relax. Once the saccular muscles contract and the radial muscles relax, what is going to happen to the pupil is that it constricts or it becomes smaller to prevent bleaching of the retina by excess light. All right, so we can see what is happening to our pupil. We are saying the pupil is becoming more narrower, right? When it becomes more narrower, it means these saccular muscles have to contract while the radial muscles, which are here, have to relax. So this is going to bring about that pupil and iris reflex when we are in intense light. Then let's talk about in dim light. What happens, or in low light intensity? So what happens is that the light reaching the retina is the image formation. So to correct this situation, what is going to happen is that the radial muscles are going to contract, the saccular muscles are going to relax, which is quite the opposite, and the pupil needs to dilate, which means it has to become wider. So when we were talking about the pupil in this image, we said it was smaller, but when you look at the size of the pupil here, it has become quite big. This is in order to enable you to form these light images on the retina, which is going to help you to see your object. So basically that is on the pupil and the iris reflex. Now let's talk about some of the defects of the eye. So when we talk about the defects of the eye, we are talking about conditions that are affecting your eye. What are some of these conditions? So number